In the forgotten meadows of Kentucky, where morning mist still clings to rolling hills, stand the crumbling remains of what was once Pleasant Hill, a Shaker community that vanished overnight in 1834. Without a trace, over 300 souls simply disappeared, leaving behind only empty buildings and a silence so profound that locals still refuse to walk those grounds after dark. Buried in archives few are brave enough to examine, the state of Kentucky has kept the official record sealed for nearly 2 centuries. But a truth so horrifying it challenges everything we thought we knew about America's religious communities has been revealed by recently uncovered testimonies from a visiting Ohio inspector. What happened at Pleasant Hill wasn't just a tragedy. Disguised as holy devotion, it was 27 years of systematic terror. Before we uncover the dark truth authorities tried so desperately to hide, I need to ask something of you. This channel isn't for everyone. Only for those brave enough to face the darkest corners of American history. If you're one of the select few who seeks these hidden truths, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what state you're listening from. Now, let's step back in time to discover how a family's greed transformed a sacred community into something far more sinister. Orchestrated by a family whose corruption ran deeper than anyone could imagine, what began in 1807 as a beacon of spiritual purity would become one of Kentucky's most carefully concealed secrets. Sweeping across Kentucky like wildfire, the Second Great Awakening was sweeping the land in 1807. In this atmosphere of religious fervor, Pleasant Hill emerged as a sanctuary for those seeking to live according to Shaker principles, celibacy, communal property, and separation from the world's corruption. Attracting hundreds of converts who willingly surrendered their earthly possessions for the promise of spiritual perfection, the community nestled in the fertile bluegrass region near Harrodsburg. Permeating every aspect of daily life, the Richardson family stood at the heart of this seemingly devout community. Claiming direct ordination from Mother and Lee's original disciples, Elder Samuel Richardson had arrived from Ohio. A tall man with piercing gray eyes and a voice that could command any congregation, his carefully maintained appearance, always dressed in simple but immaculate Shaker garb, and his encyclopedic knowledge of Shaker theology convinced even skeptical visitors of his authenticity. To maintain Shaker celibacy, his wife, Sister Martha Richardson, had publicly renounced their marriage while secretly continuing their relationship in the privacy of Samuel's expanded quarters. Possessing an almost supernatural ability to read people's motivations and fears, Martha used this skill to devastating effect in managing the community's complex social dynamics. Her soft-spoken manner and gentle smile masked a calculating intelligence that rivals found both intimidating and irresistible. Throughout the community, like the roots of an ancient oak, their family network extended. Managing the community's extensive agricultural operations was their eldest son, Brother Ezekiel Richardson, a broad-shouldered man with his father's commanding presence. He had transformed Pleasant Hill's farming from subsistence agriculture into a commercial enterprise that supplied produce markets throughout the Ohio River Valley. Serving as the community's unofficial security chief, his younger brother, Brother Caleb Richardson, monitored members' private conversations and correspondence with an efficiency that would have impressed any modern intelligence operation. Overseeing the women's dormitories and new convert orientation was Sister Rebecca Richardson, Samuel and Martha's eldest daughter. At 28, she had never married and channeled what observers described as fierce maternal instincts into managing the female members of the community. Legendary among those who survived her spiritual counseling sessions was her ability to break down psychological defenses and rebuild personalities according to Richardson family specifications. Maintaining the community's official records and correspondence was the youngest Richardson daughter, Sister Patience. Despite being only 24, she possessed a gift for forgery that allowed her to craft convincing letters in any handwriting style. Creating the documentary facade that protected the family's operations from outside scrutiny, her meticulous record-keeping followed studying a person's writing for just a few days. Controlling the community's profitable furniture workshops was Samuel's brother, Brother Jeremiah Richardson. A master craftsman who had learned woodworking before the family's corruption began, Jeremiah maintained the quality standards that made Pleasant Hill furniture sought after throughout Kentucky and beyond. Employing nearly 50 community members in what appeared to be dignified craftsmanship, his workshops functioned more like a forced labor operation. Managing their lucrative seed business that supplied farms across 3 states was Brother Isaiah Richardson, Samuel's cousin. Providing perfect cover for activities that would have horrified his business partners, Isaiah's monthly travels to distant customers made him welcome at farms from Ohio to Tennessee, where his true purposes remained carefully hidden, thanks to his gentle demeanor and obvious expertise in agricultural matters. Supervising the community's kitchens and food distribution was Martha's sister, Sister Hannah Collins. Allowing the family to reward compliance and punish dissent in ways that appeared natural to outside observers, her control over nutrition came from having studied the effects of various herbs and substances, knowledge she applied with scientific precision to manage the community's psychological and physical health. Even the extended family played crucial roles. Serving as a living symbol of the community's supposed spiritual authenticity was Samuel's elderly mother, Mother Sarah Richardson. Lending credibility to Samuel's claims of long-standing Shaker connections, her presence was bolstered by her apparent frailty, which made her an unlikely suspect in any wrongdoing. In reality, Mother Sarah was the family's strategic mastermind whose decades of experience in manipulation guided their long-term planning. Managing the community's external relationships with local authorities and neighboring communities was Brother Nathan Richardson, Samuel's youngest brother. His charm and apparent sincerity had convinced Sheriff William Morrison of Mercer County that Pleasant Hill was a model religious community deserving protection and support. Purchasing goodwill that proved invaluable when questions arose about the community's activities were Nathan's regular donations to local churches and civic organizations. Throughout Kentucky and beyond, the community's reputation spread. Visitors marveled at the pristine buildings constructed with materials purchased through the community's legitimate business profits. Producing vegetables and herbs that supplied both the community's needs and commercial markets were the perfectly ordered gardens maintained by members who worked from dawn to dusk. Impressing even skeptical observers who saw no obvious signs of coercion or abuse was the apparent contentment of the nearly 400 members. What outsiders couldn't perceive was the intricate web of surveillance and control the Richardson family had woven throughout Pleasant Hill. Flowing through family members who reported directly to Samuel and Martha during their nightly strategy sessions was every aspect of community life. Without Richardson approval, no decision, no matter how trivial, occurred. Without a Richardson family escort, no member could leave the grounds, and even brief trips to nearby Harrodsburg required detailed justification and careful supervision. What modern psychologists would recognize as a perfect totalitarian environment was what the family had created. Flowing only downward from the leadership, information was paired with surveillance that ensured any dissent was quickly identified and addressed. Making resistance seem not just futile, but unthinkable to most members was the community's isolation, both geographical and psychological. A carefully designed indoctrination process that stripped away their previous identities and rebuilt their personalities according to Richardson specifications was undergone by new converts. Supervised primarily by Rebecca and Martha Richardson, this process typically took 6 months to complete. By its conclusion, new members had been psychologically transformed into compliant followers who viewed questioning the family's authority as tantamount to questioning God himself. At every turn, the community's daily routine reinforced this control. To the sound of Brother Caleb's bell, members rose at 4:30 each morning, ate breakfast prepared under Hannah Collins's supervision, and spent their days at assigned tasks that had been carefully designed to prevent private conversations or independent thinking. Combining genuine spiritual elements with subtle psychological manipulation that reinforced dependency and discouraged critical thinking were the evening worship services led by Samuel Richardson, with various family members playing supporting roles. On a frigid February morning in 1812, the first crack in Pleasant Hill's perfect facade appeared when Brother Thomas Whitman, a successful merchant who had donated his entire estate to the community 5 years earlier, began asking uncomfortable questions about the community's finances during a public meeting. As one of the community's earliest and most generous converts, Brother Thomas had arrived at Pleasant Hill in 1807. A widower in his 50s whose children had died in a cholera outbreak, he had found comfort in the Shaker promise of spiritual family and eternal purpose. Providing much of the capital that allowed the Richardson family to establish their operations on such a grand scale was his donation of a thriving dry goods business and substantial property holdings. For 5 years, Thomas had been the model community member. He worked tirelessly in Brother Ezekiel's agricultural operations, served as a mentor to younger converts, and never questioned the leadership's decisions. Impressing visitors and reinforcing the community's reputation for spiritual authenticity was his transformation from successful businessman to humble Shaker brother. But Thomas's business background made him uniquely qualified to notice discrepancies that escaped other members' attention. Gradually revealing inconsistencies that troubled his conscience, his trained eye for financial details combined with his access to certain operational records through his agricultural work. During the monthly community meeting, Brother Thomas stood, his weathered hands holding several pages of carefully calculated figures. "Brothers and sisters," he said, "I've been praying about some concerns that weigh heavy on my heart. Our blessed community has prospered beyond measure. Yet I see contradictions in our records that trouble my soul." The silence that followed was deafening. Around the packed meeting hall, Richardson family members exchanged glances that lasted mere seconds but communicated volumes. Samuel Richardson's face remained serene, his hands folded peacefully in his lap. But those who knew him well noticed the subtle tightening around his eyes. Sister Martha's gentle smile never wavered, yet her knuckles whitened as she gripped her prayer book with increasing pressure. "The seed business," Thomas continued, his voice gaining strength as he warmed to his topic. "Brother Isaiah reported profits of $800 from Ohio customers last quarter. But when I delivered supplies to those same farms, I calculated sales that should have generated nearly $1,200. Where has this missing money gone?" From his seat near the door, Brother Caleb Richardson rose, ostensibly to check the room's temperature, but his movement positioned him between Thomas and the exit. Never leaving Thomas's face, Sister Rebecca's eyes catalogued every expression and gesture for later analysis. Creating an almost imperceptible web of surveillance and control, other Richardson family members around the room made subtle adjustments to their positions. Furthermore, Thomas pressed on, apparently oblivious to the dangerous territory he was entering. "Our membership rolls show 400 souls, yet our food consumption suggests we're feeding barely 250. Brother Jeremiah's furniture workshops claim to employ 50 members, but I count only 37 who regularly report for that duty. These numbers don't reconcile. And as stewards of God's bounty, shouldn't we demand accuracy in our accounting?" The response came not from Samuel, but from Mother Sarah Richardson, whose elderly voice carried surprising authority across the silent hall. "Brother Thomas," she said, her tone mixing gentle correction with unmistakable warning, "your concerns show a heart still attached to worldly thinking. In our blessed community, we trust that our leaders, guided by divine wisdom, manage all temporal matters for our spiritual benefit. Perhaps you need time for prayer and reflection to overcome these doubts that trouble your faith." Nodding gravely, Samuel Richardson's expression radiated paternal concern for a wayward child. "Brother Thomas, your dedication to our community's welfare touches my heart deeply. But perhaps your mind has been clouded by memories of your former worldly life. Sister Hannah, would you prepare Brother Thomas some of your special chamomile tea? I believe he needs rest and reflection to clear his thoughts of these troubling concerns." For another hour, the meeting continued, but Thomas Whitman's questions had fundamentally altered the atmosphere. Avoiding eye contact with him, other members suddenly found urgent reasons to examine their prayer books or adjust their clothing. Carrying an underlying tension that hadn't existed before Thomas's intervention were the Richardson family's responses to subsequent business items. That evening, Thomas was found dead in his dormitory bed by Sister Rebecca, who discovered the body during her routine evening inspection of the men's quarters. Painting a picture of peaceful transition was her tearful announcement to the gathered community. Brother Thomas passed gently in his sleep, called home by the Lord after confessing his sin of doubt during evening prayers. His last words were an apology for allowing worldly concerns to cloud his spiritual vision. With the resigned faith they'd been conditioned to embrace, the community accepted this explanation. After all, questioning the leadership's account of events was tantamount to questioning God's will. A lesson about the dangers of allowing business concerns to interfere with spiritual submission, Brother Thomas's funeral the following day became. But young Sister Mary Caldwell, who cleaned the dormitories each morning, noticed details that would haunt her for decades. When she entered Thomas's room to prepare it for cleaning, she was struck by the bitter almond smell that lingered despite the room's windows being open all night. That she'd never seen on any corpse, including her own grandfather who had died peacefully at home, was the distinct blue color Thomas's fingernails had turned. Most disturbing of all, she discovered traces of white foam around Thomas's mouth that Sister Rebecca had carefully wiped away before calling for help. In growing horror, Mary watched as Brother Caleb Richardson collected all of Thomas's personal papers, including the financial calculations that had started the crisis. During what Samuel Richardson described as a cleansing ceremony to purge worldly attachments from our sacred space, these documents, along with Thomas's ledger books and correspondence, were burned in the communal fireplace that very night. How thoroughly the Richardsons controlled information flow and emotional responses was revealed by the community's reaction. Within hours of Thomas's death, Sister Martha was leading prayer circles where members confessed their own doubts and worldly thoughts, creating an atmosphere where questioning leadership became synonymous with spiritual failure. Organizing intensive work details that kept potential questioners busy from dawn to dusk, leaving no time for private conversations or independent reflection, was Brother Ezekiel. Leading evening discussions about the dangers of challenging spiritual authority using Thomas as a cautionary tale of what happened when faith wavered and worldly concerns corrupted pure hearts was Brother Jeremiah. Serving the dual purpose of preventing future dissent while identifying members whose responses suggested they might harbor similar doubts, these sessions became a regular feature of community life. The most chilling aspect of the community's response was how quickly Thomas Whitman's memory was systematically erased. Within days, his personal belongings were redistributed. His work assignments were transferred to other members and his name removed from community records except for a brief death notice. Within a month, it was as if Brother Thomas had never existed at all, his questions forgotten and his concerns dismissed as the ravings of a mind corrupted by worldly attachment. In the months following Thomas Whitman's death, a pattern began to emerge that would continue for over 2 decades, growing more sophisticated and ruthless with each iteration. Experiencing what the Richardsons termed spiritual crisis, requiring special intervention, were members who asked probing questions about finances, who expressed desire to visit family outside the community, or who showed signs of wanting to leave Pleasant Hill. For handling dissent, Brother Jeremiah Richardson developed what became known as the retreat system. When someone questioned community practices or showed signs of independence, they would be assigned to special prayer and fasting retreats in isolated cabins scattered across the community's extensive property. Presented as opportunities for troubled souls to reconnect with divine purpose through solitude and meditation, these retreats were always supervised by various Richardson family members. Constructed under Brother Jeremiah's direction in remote corners of the community's thousands of acres, the retreat cabins were designed to appear rustic and spiritual while serving their true purpose as holding facilities. Containing a single room with basic furniture, heavy wooden shutters that could be barred from outside, and doors that locked only from the exterior, each cabin's isolated location, connected to the main community only by narrow paths through dense woods, ensured that any sounds from within would never reach other members. The logistics of identifying retreat candidates were managed by Brother Caleb Richardson. Reported private conversations, observed relationships, and monitored correspondence for signs of disloyalty or independent thinking was his network of informants throughout the community. So subtle were his methods that most members never realized they were being watched, attributing chance encounters with Caleb to coincidence rather than systematic surveillance. Carefully developed criteria were followed by the selection process for retreats. Prime candidates were recent converts who asked too many questions about absent family members, as were longer-term members who showed signs of developing leadership potential that might threaten Richardson authority. Also finding themselves selected for spiritual intervention were members who demonstrated excessive attachment to possessions they had donated, who expressed homesickness during community meetings, or who formed close friendships that might enable organized resistance. With remarkable sophistication, Sister Hannah Collins managed the community's correspondence, ensuring that worried family members received carefully crafted letters explaining their loved ones' sudden departures or deaths. Flawless was her penmanship, and she had studied each member's writing style with scientific precision, enabling her to forge convincing final letters that would satisfy distant relatives for years to come. Extensive preparation and planning were required by Hannah's forgery operation. She maintained detailed files on each community member's background, including samples of their handwriting, information about distant relatives, and knowledge of their pre-conversion lives that could be referenced in false correspondence. When someone was selected for elimination, Hannah would prepare multiple letters to be sent over several months, creating the illusion of an ongoing correspondence that gradually explained the person's absence. From children they would never see again, parents in Ohio received touching notes describing spiritual revelations that called them to missionary work in untamed Western territories. Complete with descriptions of final words and burial ceremonies that never occurred, siblings in Pennsylvania got detailed accounts of peaceful deaths following brief illnesses. Designed to provide closure while discouraging further inquiry, the letters were masterpieces of emotional manipulation. Perfect cover for disposing of evidence and maintaining the community's external relationships was provided by Brother Isaiah Richardson's seed business. Offering opportunities to bury bodies in remote locations across Kentucky, Ohio, and Tennessee, while simultaneously conducting legitimate business that reinforced his reputation as a trustworthy merchant and devout Shaker brother, were his monthly trips to distant farms. Carefully planned to serve multiple purposes were Isaiah's routes. Providing alibis for his presence in distant locations were his legitimate customers, while his knowledge of remote farm properties, gained through years of business relationships, enabled him to identify burial sites that would never be discovered. He developed relationships with isolated farmers who welcomed his visits and never questioned his occasional requests to camp overnight on their property during bad weather. Methodical and efficient was the disposal process. Transported in specially modified seed wagons that appeared to contain normal agricultural supplies but included hidden compartments designed for their grisly cargo, bodies were carried. Meant that his overnight absences during trips were never questioned by customers who assumed he was maintaining his demanding schedule was Isaiah's reputation for punctuality and reliability. When they occasionally inquired about missing persons, local authorities were shown immaculate records maintained by Sister Patience Richardson. A marvel of bureaucratic deception, her documentation system demonstrated through carefully crafted paperwork that individuals had left voluntarily for other communities or had died of natural causes with proper burial in the community cemetery. Far beyond simple membership logs extended Patience's record-keeping. She maintained detailed medical histories that could explain sudden deaths from natural causes, travel documentation that supported claims about members departing for distant communities, and correspondence files that included both genuine letters and Hannah's forgeries. Ensuring that any official inquiry could be answered with convincing documentation that withstood casual scrutiny were her organizational skills. Perhaps more chilling than their physical crimes was the psychological control the Richardson family maintained. They had created a closed system where questioning authority was equated with spiritual failure, where blind obedience was the highest virtue, and where members policed each other's thoughts and behaviors. Not just victims, the remaining community members had been transformed into unwitting accomplices in their own oppression. At around 400 members, the community's population remained steady despite the constant stream of new converts arriving monthly and the mysterious disappearances that occurred with increasing frequency. Maintained through what Brother Caleb privately called natural selection, the systematic removal of anyone who posed a threat to family control, balanced by aggressive recruitment of new converts whose property donations financed the operation's expansion, was the stability. Carefully screened by the Richardson women, who had developed sophisticated methods for identifying potential troublemakers before they could influence other members, were new arrivals. Actually serving to assess each convert's psychological profile, family connections, and potential value to the community were Sister Rebecca's intake interviews conducted under the guise of spiritual counseling. Marked for early elimination were those deemed dangerous, while valuable converts underwent intensive indoctrination designed to strip away their previous identities. Refined over years of practice, the indoctrination process combined genuine spiritual elements with systematic psychological abuse that created trauma bonds between victims and their abusers. Isolated from contact with the outside world, new converts were subjected to alternating periods of intense attention and deliberate neglect that broke down their psychological defenses and made them desperate for approval from community leaders. By 1825, Pleasant Hill operated like a well-oiled machine of exploitation. Working together with mechanical precision that would have impressed any efficiency expert were its various components. Transforming what had begun as opportunistic crimes into a sophisticated criminal enterprise that generated enormous profits while maintaining an impeccable public reputation, the Richardson family had refined their methods over 18 years of practice. Into a complex organizational structure that maximized efficiency while minimizing risk had evolved the family's division of labor. Maintaining his role as spiritual leader and public face of the community, Samuel Richardson delivered inspiring sermons that drew new converts regularly while keeping existing members focused on heavenly rewards rather than earthly concerns. Legendary throughout Kentucky's religious communities had become his charismatic presence, with ministers from other denominations frequently citing Pleasant Hill as an example of successful Christian living. What amounted to a science of psychological manipulation had been developed by Martha Richardson. Studying each community member with the intensity of a naturalist observing specimens, her methods for breaking down individual resistance and rebuilding personalities according to family specifications had become so refined that the process typically took only 3 to 4 months to complete. She maintained detailed psychological profiles on every member, updating them regularly based on observations from her network of female relatives and informants. More sophisticated criminal operations that generated multiple revenue streams had been enabled by the community's expansion. Supplying produce to markets in Louisville, Lexington, and Cincinnati, Brother Ezekiel Richardson's agricultural operations now generated enormous profits that never appeared in the books shown to members. Providing labor costs that made Pleasant Hill farms impossibly profitable compared to conventional operations was his workforce of unpaid community members, maintained through psychological coercion rather than physical restraint. Similarly expanded had Brother Jeremiah Richardson's furniture workshops, producing pieces that were sold throughout the Ohio River Valley and marketed as authentic Shaker craftsmanship. Remaining high because Jeremiah genuinely understood woodworking, the quality was paired with labor that was essentially slavery disguised as religious devotion. Putting in 12 to 14-hour days producing furniture that sold for premium prices with profits flowing entirely to the Richardson family's private accounts were his workers. How the family had begun selling community members to buyers who operated plantations and industrial facilities throughout the South and Midwest was the most insidious development. Providing the highest profit margins of any family enterprise while explaining the mysterious disappearances that might otherwise have attracted unwanted attention, this human trafficking operation was coordinated primarily by Brother Isaiah during his seed business travels. Coldly calculated criteria were followed by the selection process for trafficking victims. Prime candidates were younger members with valuable skills but dangerous independent tendencies, as were individuals whose family connections made their continued presence at Pleasant Hill potentially problematic. Substantial sums for workers who came with fabricated documentation proving their voluntary servitude were paid by the buyers, who believed they were purchasing indentured servants rather than free citizens. The family specialist in breaking down new converts and identifying those suitable for different fates had become Sister Rebecca Richardson. Disguised as spiritual counseling, her psychological assessment process enabled her to categorize newcomers into groups: valuable long-term assets who would remain at Pleasant Hill, potential trafficking victims who could be sold for profit, and dangerous individuals who needed immediate elimination. Combining genuine spiritual guidance with systematic abuse that created powerful trauma bonds between victims and their abusers were Rebecca's methods. Studying the conversion experiences of legitimate Shaker communities, she had then perverted these techniques to serve the family's criminal purposes. Leaving converts psychologically dependent on her approval while stripping away their connections to previous identities and relationships, her sessions were transformative. Both geographical and psychological had the community's isolation become, with members existing in a closed information environment where the Richardson family controlled every source of knowledge and interpretation. Located on thousands of acres of family-controlled land, members rarely encountered outsiders except during carefully supervised visits to nearby towns. Monitored all interactions and reported any conversations that suggested disloyalty were even these excursions, managed by Richardson family members. Extensive relationships with local authorities that provided protection from official scrutiny had been cultivated by the family. Essentially a paid ally had Sheriff William Morrison of Mercer County become, receiving regular donations to his campaign funds and personal accounts in exchange for his assumption that Pleasant Hill was a model religious community deserving protection rather than investigation. Throughout the region's power structure, these relationships extended. Among local merchants, politicians, and religious leaders who viewed Pleasant Hill as a valuable economic and spiritual asset to their communities, Brother Nathan Richardson's charm offensive had won allies. Substantial tax revenue and employment opportunities that made local officials reluctant to investigate rumors or complaints were provided by the community's legitimate business operations. To include elaborate rituals and ceremonies that reinforced member dependency while identifying potential dissent had the psychological control mechanisms evolved. Combining authentic Shaker elements with subtle psychological manipulation that created altered states of consciousness where critical thinking became impossible were Samuel Richardson's worship services. Often lasting for hours, these services left participants emotionally drained and psychologically vulnerable to suggestion. Multiple purposes beyond spiritual guidance were served by the evening confession sessions led by various Richardson family members. They provided opportunities to identify members harboring doubts or resentments, created public pressure for conformity through shame and guilt, and enabled the family to gather intelligence about private conversations and relationships that might threaten their control. Increasingly elaborate had the confession process become, with different family members specializing in extracting specific types of information. On relationships and emotional attachments that might enable resistance was Sister Rebecca's focus, while on practical concerns like escape plans or contact with outside authorities was Brother Caleb's concentration. For information about family members outside the community who might become problematic if they began asking questions was Sister Hannah's monitoring of confessions. The family's strategic mastermind, whose decades of experience in manipulation guided their long-term planning, had emerged as Mother Sarah Richardson, despite her apparent frailty. Legendary among family members who referred to her privately as the General, in recognition of her tactical brilliance, had become her ability to appear harmless while orchestrating complex criminal operations. To every aspect of the operation, from the selection of new territories for expansion to the development of new techniques for psychological control, extended Sarah's influence. Enabling her to predict how individuals would respond to various pressures and rewards was her understanding of human nature, gained through 70 years of observing and manipulating others. From opportunistic theft into a sustainable business model that could theoretically continue indefinitely had her strategic vision transformed the family's criminal enterprise. Increasingly sophisticated methods for maintaining security and preventing exposure had been required by the expansion of their operations. Elaborate communication systems that enabled coordination across their various enterprises while minimizing the risk of interception by hostile parties had been developed by the family. They used coded language in their correspondence, maintained separate financial accounts for different operations, and created false identities that could be used if rapid escape became necessary. From an unexpected source came the beginning of the end for the Richardson family's 27-year reign of terror. Attention from the legitimate Shaker leadership in Ohio had been attracted by their own success. In late 1833, the Ohio Union of Shaker Communities decided to send Elder Joseph Meacham, one of their most experienced and respected leaders, to evaluate Pleasant Hill for potential inclusion in their formal alliance of authenticated Shaker settlements. Not the typical visitor the Richardsons were accustomed to managing was Elder Meacham. A genuine disciple of Mother and Lee's teachings who had spent 40 years in Shaker communities across New York, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, he possessed an intimate knowledge of proper Shaker practices, record-keeping, and community structure that made him nearly impossible to deceive. To verify that Pleasant Hill truly followed authentic Shaker principles before recommending them for official recognition and inclusion in the Union's collective decision-making processes was his mission. After years of glowing reports about Pleasant Hill's spiritual achievements and economic success had come the evaluation request. Impressed by accounts of the community's growth, their reputation for quality craftsmanship, and their apparent success in maintaining celibacy and communal property arrangements over more than 2 decades had been the Ohio leadership. Both an honor and a potentially devastating threat to the Richardson family's carefully constructed facade represented the decision to send Meacham. With apparent enthusiasm, Samuel Richardson initially welcomed the evaluation, confident that his family's carefully constructed facade would fool another religious leader. After all, they had successfully deceived hundreds of visitors over the years, including ministers from other denominations who had left Pleasant Hill convinced of its spiritual authenticity. Confidence that they could control the process and manipulate Meacham's conclusions had been given to them by the family's experience in managing inspections. But immediately raised alarm bells throughout the Richardson network did Meacham's first requests. Unlike previous visitors who were content with guided tours and carefully staged demonstrations of community life, Meacham wanted to examine financial records going back to the community's founding in 1807. Without Richardson family supervision or preparation, he insisted on speaking privately with randomly selected members. Most troubling of all, he brought his own accounting ledgers and expected to reconcile Pleasant Hill's reported membership numbers with their consumption records, work output, and correspondence logs. During his first meeting with Samuel Richardson, conducted in the community's main meeting hall before an audience of senior members, the scope of Meacham's investigation became clear. "Brother Samuel," Meacham said in his quiet but authoritative voice, "the Ohio Union has developed standardized procedures for evaluating potential member communities. We'll need to review your membership rolls, financial records, correspondence files, and burial registers for the past 5 years. We'll also need to conduct private interviews with at least 50 members selected through random drawing. The first crack in his usually perfect composure was revealed by Samuel's response. Elder Meacham, we are honored by your visit and eager to demonstrate our commitment to Mother N's teachings. However, our record-keeping follows Kentucky practices that may differ from Ohio's standards. Perhaps we could arrange a more informal evaluation that better reflects our unique circumstances. Remaining pleasant but firm was Meacham's expression. I appreciate your regional considerations, Brother Samuel, but the union standards apply equally to all communities regardless of location. Authentic Shaker practices are universal, not subject to regional variation. We'll begin with the membership rolls and burial registers tomorrow morning. That evening, the Richardson family held an emergency meeting in Samuel's private quarters, their voices hushed but their panic evident to anyone who might have been listening. With the authority of someone accustomed to managing crisis, Mother Sarah Richardson, despite her apparent frailty, took charge of the strategy session. "This man knows things we can't fake," she whispered urgently. "He's asking for documentation we can't provide without exposing everything. We need to delay, deflect, and if necessary, eliminate the threat before he completes his investigation." The first to articulate the scope of their vulnerability was Brother Isaiah Richardson. "He's asking for records going back 5 years, but our problems go back much further. The membership numbers alone will expose us. Our books show 400 members, but we've got maybe 250 actually living here. The burial registers are even worse. We've got graves for people who supposedly left for other communities." Another terrifying dimension to their predicament was added by Sister Hannah Collins. "He's already identified inconsistencies in the correspondence I've been maintaining with other communities. He knows Shaker writing conventions I never learned. And he's asking questions about Mother Lee's teachings that our people can't answer because they were never properly instructed." Only intensified his suspicions and strengthened his resolve to uncover the truth did the family's initial attempts to delay and deflect Meacham's investigation. When they claimed certain records were stored in a building that had been damaged by recent storms, he pointed out that none of the buildings showed signs of weather damage. When they suggested interviewing specific members who could vouch for community practices, he insisted on selecting interview subjects himself through random drawing from a complete membership list. So effective at monitoring community members, Brother Caleb Richardson's surveillance network proved useless against an investigator who understood the importance of maintaining operational security. Varying his routines, conducting interviews in different locations, and seeming to possess an intuitive awareness of when he was being watched, Meacham's questions during member interviews revealed a depth of knowledge about authentic Shaker practices that made it impossible to maintain their deceptions. Most dangerously, some of the community's surviving members began responding to Meacham's genuine spiritual presence in ways that terrified the Richardson family. Sister Mary Caldwell, who had witnessed Brother Thomas Whitman's suspicious death over 20 years earlier, found herself drawn to Meacham's obvious authenticity and began sharing her long-suppressed observations about members who had mysteriously disappeared. Profound and immediate was the psychological effect of Meacham's presence on community members. For the first time in decades, they encountered someone whose spiritual authority didn't depend on fear, manipulation, or psychological abuse. Creating an atmosphere where long-buried doubts and memories began to surface were his gentle questions about their experiences, his obvious knowledge of authentic Shaker practices, and his genuine concern for their spiritual welfare. Brother Jeremiah Richardson, whose furniture workshops provided crucial income for the family's operations, found his workers becoming increasingly unproductive as they spent time talking with Meacham about traditional Shaker craftsmanship techniques they had never been taught. Gaps in their knowledge that made it obvious they weren't receiving proper instruction in authentic Shaker methods were revealed by the conversations. Sister Rebecca Richardson's carefully controlled dormitory system began breaking down as female members started asking questions about Shaker practices they'd never heard of before Meacham's arrival. Questionable when compared to the obvious authenticity of their visitor's spiritual knowledge and gentle demeanor suddenly seemed her authority, so absolute for so many years. When Meacham requested access to the community cemetery for a private memorial service honoring departed members, the investigation took a decisive turn. Without appearing suspicious, the Richardson family couldn't refuse such a reasonable request, but they also couldn't allow him to examine the burial grounds too closely without risking exposure of their crimes. Hoping to control what he observed and limit his time among the graves, Brother Caleb volunteered to escort Meacham to the cemetery. But inconsistencies that had escaped casual observers for decades were immediately noticed by Meacham's trained eye. The burial patterns didn't match the death dates in official records, and the condition of grave markers suggested many more interments than the documented deaths could account for. "Brother Caleb," Meacham said quietly as they stood among the headstones, "I noticed some irregularities in your burial records. This grave marker indicates Brother William died in 1829, but your correspondence files show letters from him dated 1830. How do you explain this discrepancy?" The desperation that was beginning to infect the entire family was revealed by Caleb's response. "Elder Meacham, perhaps there was an error in our record-keeping. Our sister Patience maintains extensive files, but even the most careful record-keeper can make mistakes when dealing with so many community members over so many years." Remaining thoughtful but skeptical was Meacham's expression. "I understand that record-keeping can be challenging, but Shaker communities traditionally maintain extremely accurate documentation of deaths and departures. The inconsistencies I'm observing suggest systematic problems rather than occasional errors. That would expose the full scope of the Richardson family's crimes and bring their 27-year reign of terror to an end," was the discovery made by Meacham that night. On the night of March 15, 1834, Elder Meacham made a discovery that would expose the full scope of the Richardson family's 27-year reign of terror. Unable to sleep due to his growing suspicions about the discrepancies he had uncovered during 3 weeks of investigation, he decided to examine the community's cemetery by moonlight, hoping to reconcile burial records with actual grave sites without Richardson family supervision. A graveyard that told two completely different stories was what he found. For visitors and official inspections, the official cemetery contained approximately 40 graves with proper headstones dating from 1807 to 1834. Well-crafted, obviously expensive, and arranged in neat rows that suggested careful planning and maintenance were the markers. But inconsistencies in the ground itself that revealed a far more sinister reality were noticed by Meacham's trained eye, sharpened by decades of experience managing authentic Shaker communities. Subtle depressions and variations in soil color that suggested many more burials than the headstones indicated were shown by areas throughout the cemetery. Disturbed and allowed to settle, forming barely perceptible indentations that would escape casual observation but were obvious to someone who understood how burial grounds evolved over time, had been the earth in these unmarked sections. Also revealed the truth did the vegetation patterns. Different plant growth than others, indicating soil that had been repeatedly disturbed and replaced, was supported by certain areas. When he examined the dated graves more carefully, Meacham realized that many of the supposed death dates corresponded exactly with his list of members who had allegedly left Pleasant Hill to found new communities or visit distant relatives. Was more chilling still. The timeline was impossible. How could someone die and be buried at Pleasant Hill on the same day they were reported to have departed for Ohio or Tennessee? A pattern of deception so elaborate that it demonstrated years of careful planning was revealed by his systematic examination of each grave marker. Next to those who had allegedly left for missionary work in distant territories were buried members who had supposedly died of natural causes. A chronicle of systematic elimination that coincided perfectly with moments when the community faced potential exposure or internal resistance was formed by the dates. By Sister Mary Caldwell, who had been watching from her dormitory window and recognized an opportunity to finally reveal the truth she had carried for over 20 years, was Meacham's investigation interrupted. With the desperate courage of someone who knew this might be her only chance to expose the horrors she had witnessed, moving silently through the darkness, she approached the cemetery. "Elder Meacham," she whispered urgently as she approached his lantern-lit figure among the gravestones, "God has sent you to reveal the truth we've been too terrified to speak. What you're seeing here is only a small part of what the Richardson family has done to this community." In a conversation conducted in hushed tones among the silent graves, Mary revealed the horrifying truth she had carried in terrified silence for decades. "I've seen them bury people in the middle of the night," she said, her voice shaking with suppressed terror and long-awaited relief. "The Richardson family, they don't just control this community. They've been systematically murdering anyone who threatens their power or questions their authority. A picture of systematic elimination that went far beyond occasional murders to maintain control was painted by Mary's testimony, delivered in broken whispers as they crouched between headstones to avoid detection. A death camp disguised as a religious community where members who questioned finances, expressed homesickness, showed leadership potential, or simply knew too much about the family's activities were methodically eliminated was what the Richardson family had created. Sister Hannah Collins keeps poisons in the kitchen stores, Mary revealed, her words tumbling out with the urgency of someone finally able to speak truth after years of enforced silence. I've seen her preparing special meals for people who were asking too many questions. Brother Thomas Whitman wasn't the first. He was just the first time I was brave enough to really look at what was happening. As Mary continued her desperate confession, the scope of the family's criminal network became clear. Brother Caleb Richardson knows which members plan to leave before they even tell anyone. He reads their private letters and listens at dormitory doors. He has a list of people he calls problems, and they disappear within days of being identified. Glancing nervously toward the main buildings to ensure they weren't being observed, she continued, and Brother Jeremiah, he's the one who disposes of the bodies. He has burial sites all across Kentucky, places where he buries people during his furniture delivery trips. I've seen him loading covered wagons at night, and I've seen him return with empty wagons and dirt under his fingernails. The scope of the family's operations beyond simple murder was the most horrifying revelation. A human trafficking network that sold the community's younger, healthier members to plantation owners and industrial operations as indentured servants was described by Mary. They don't kill everyone, she explained. The young ones, the strong ones, they sell them. Brother Isaiah's seed business is just a cover. He's actually delivering people to buyers throughout the South. That Pleasant Hill wasn't a corrupted Shaker community, it was a criminal enterprise that had never been legitimately Shaker at all, was realized by Elder Meacham. That the Richardson family had likely murdered the original Shaker leaders who established the settlement, then assumed their identities to inherit a ready-made community of trusting, obedient followers was revealed by Mary's knowledge of the community's early history. The real Elder Samuel died in 1808, Mary whispered, just 1 year after the community was founded. I was just a girl then, but I remember him being different, gentler, more concerned with our spiritual welfare than with profits and control. The man who calls himself Samuel Richardson now is someone else entirely. With devastating force, the implications of Mary's revelations hit Meacham. Not only had the Richardson family been committing mass murder for over 25 years, but they had done so while systematically destroying the authentic Shaker community that had originally been established at Pleasant Hill. Into a tool for exploitation and murder had they perverted genuine spiritual seeking, using people's deepest religious longings as weapons against them. As dawn approached, Meacham faced a terrible choice that would determine the fate of the nearly 250 community members who remained alive. If he confronted the Richardson family directly with his knowledge, he would almost certainly become their next victim, and his death would eliminate the only outside witness to their crimes. But if he left Pleasant Hill to seek outside help, the family might eliminate all the remaining witnesses before authorities could intervene. Upon him as he knelt among the silent graves pressed the weight of nearly 300 lives lost, and the 250 souls still trapped in this nightmare. Beside him, her fate now linked to his decisions, waited Mary Caldwell. Around them, the cemetery held its secrets in the pre-dawn darkness, bearing witness to decades of systematic murder disguised as religious devotion. Whether the Richardson family's reign of terror continued, or whether justice would finally come to Pleasant Hill after 27 years of carefully concealed horror, would be determined by Meacham's decision. The events that would finally bring justice to the Richardson family's victims were set in motion by Elder Meacham's decision to flee Pleasant Hill in the pre-dawn hours of March 16, 1834, carrying Mary Caldwell with him as a witness. Through the night to Harrodsburg, they rode, where Meacham convinced Sheriff Morrison and a federal marshal to organize an immediate raid on the community. Crucial proved the federal authorities' involvement, armed with Mary's detailed testimony and Meacham's documentation of the numerous discrepancies he had discovered, as it later emerged that Sheriff Morrison had been receiving regular payments from the Richardson family for his willful blindness to their activities. A detachment of 12 men and legal authority that superseded local jurisdiction was brought by the federal marshal, Captain James Crawford, ensuring that the Richardson family couldn't use their network of corrupted officials to escape justice. A scene that haunts Kentucky law enforcement records to this day was what the authorities discovered upon their return to Pleasant Hill. A desperate decision to eliminate all witnesses and escape with whatever portable wealth they could carry had been made by the Richardson family, realizing their exposure was inevitable. Still living when the raid commenced were only 37 of the 250 community members who had been alive when Meacham arrived 3 weeks earlier. Stories that revealed the true scope of the Richardson family's crimes over nearly 3 decades were told by the surviving members, discovered locked in basement storage rooms beneath the community's main buildings. Without food or water for 2 days while the family debated whether to kill them all or select the most valuable for sale to distant buyers before fleeing Kentucky permanently had they been confined. For their youth and physical capabilities rather than any mercy from their captors, these survivors represented the strongest evidence of the family's human trafficking operations. Already completed were transportation arrangements and payments received for several who had been marked for sale to plantation owners in Mississippi and Alabama. A systematic operation that had sold hundreds of community members into slavery while maintaining the facade of voluntary departures for missionary work was revealed by their testimony. Every horrific detail of the survivors' testimonies was supported by the physical evidence discovered during the raid. Containing remains that showed signs of poisoning, strangulation, and blunt force trauma were hidden burial sites found throughout the community's extensive property. Indicating the location of every hidden grave, the burial sites were methodically organized with detailed maps found in Brother Jeremiah Richardson's workshop. Across the community's thousands of acres, searchers discovered over 150 unmarked graves scattered, many containing multiple bodies that had been disposed of during the same time periods. That the Richardson family had been systematically murdering community members since at least 1812, with the killing accelerating dramatically in recent years as their confidence in their methods grew, was confirmed by the condition of the remains combined with artifacts found in the graves. Detailed ledgers documenting their human trafficking operations with the precision of any legitimate business enterprise were found by investigators in the Richardson family's private quarters. The names of buyers, the prices paid for individual community members, and detailed descriptions of the merchandise being sold were included in the records. Over $40,000 in profits over the past decade, far exceeding the income from their legitimate business activities, had been generated by the trafficking operation. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery of Martha Richardson's personal journal, which revealed the psychological techniques the family had developed to maintain control over their victims. Systematic experiments in human manipulation that would have impressed modern psychologists with their sophistication and ruthlessness were documented in the journal, written over 15 years. No remorse for the hundreds of lives destroyed by her family's activities was shown in Martha's writings. Instead, they contained clinical observations about which methods proved most effective for different personality types, detailed analyses of how to break down psychological resistance, and strategic planning for expanding their operations to other states. A woman who viewed other human beings as resources to be exploited rather than souls deserving of respect and compassion was revealed by her entries. Detailed psychological profiles of every community member, updated regularly based on observations from her network of female relatives and informants, were also contained in the journal. Assessments of each person's value as a worker, their potential for resistance, their usefulness as breeding stock for future generations of workers, and their suitability for various types of exploitation were included in these profiles. Swift and decisive was the Richardson family's fate, though their trial revealed details that shocked even experienced law enforcement officials. Multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, fraud, and human trafficking saw Samuel, Martha, and their 6 adult children arrested and charged. National attention was drawn by the trial, conducted in Frankfurt throughout the summer of 1834, as newspapers across the country covered the unprecedented scope of their crimes. A picture of systematic evil that challenged contemporary understanding of human depravity was painted by the testimony presented during the trial. Decades of psychological torture, physical abuse, and systematic murder carried out with the efficiency of a business operation were described by witness after witness. Only 2 hours were required by the jury to return guilty verdicts on all charges, the evidence was so overwhelming. Before crowds that included many former community members who had escaped or been sold into slavery years earlier, all 7 Richardson family members were convicted and sentenced to death, with executions carried out in October 1834. A sense of justice for the victims was provided by the executions, but they couldn't restore the lives that had been stolen or heal the trauma that would affect survivors for the rest of their lives. The overwhelming challenge of rebuilding their lives after decades of psychological and physical abuse that had stripped away their identities and connections to the outside world was faced by the 37 survivors. What we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder was struggled with by many, unable to trust religious communities, authority figures, or even their own judgment about other people's motivations. From their experiences at Pleasant Hill, several survivors never recovered. Unable to function independently in normal society, the systematic psychological abuse they had endured left them haunted by memories of the horrors they had witnessed and the friends they had lost to the Richardson family's systematic brutality. They spent their remaining years in state institutions. With the help of genuine religious communities that provided psychological support and practical assistance, others found the strength to rebuild their lives. A special fund to help Pleasant Hill survivors transition to normal life was established by the Ohio Union of Shaker Communities, led by Elder Meacham, providing financial support, job training, and counseling services that helped many eventually achieve some measure of peace and stability. Most of the Pleasant Hill investigation records were quietly sealed by the state of Kentucky, concerned that publicizing the full details would damage the region's reputation and discourage religious settlement throughout the Bluegrass region. Under state supervision, the community's buildings were eventually demolished and the land sold to private farmers who were told only that the previous religious community had disbanded following financial difficulties. That many details never became public knowledge meant the secrecy surrounding the case, allowing rumors and speculation to replace factual accounts of what had actually occurred at Pleasant Hill. The state's interests in preventing copycat crimes and protecting Kentucky's reputation were served by this deliberate obscurity. But it also meant that the victims' stories were never fully told and their suffering never adequately acknowledged. That the Richardson family murdered or sold into slavery over 400 people during their 27-year operation is estimated by modern historians who have gained access to the sealed records. Even higher may be the actual number, as their record-keeping focused on profits rather than comprehensive documentation of their crimes, and many victims may have been eliminated without any record of their existence at Pleasant Hill. How easily religious faith can be weaponized by those who understand the psychology of control and manipulation is shown to us by this mystery. Because they exploited people's deepest spiritual longings, transforming the desire for divine connection into a tool of oppression and murder, the Richardson family succeeded for nearly 3 decades. The isolation they created around their victims, cutting them off from outside support and making resistance seem impossible rather than merely difficult, was what their success depended on. That evil often disguises itself as virtue, using the language of spirituality and community to mask the most brutal exploitation, is what the Pleasant Hill tragedy reminds us. The importance of maintaining connections between religious communities and the broader society, ensuring that isolation never becomes so complete that abuse can flourish undetected, is demonstrated by the Richardson family's ability to maintain their facade for so many years. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or might there be even darker secrets buried in Kentucky's sealed archives? That the full scope of the Richardson family's crimes may never be completely understood is suggested by the state's decision to keep most records classified. Leave your comment below and share your theories about what other horrors might still be hidden in those forbidden files. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.